Easy now, put it right here. Next row, keep it orderly.
January 17th, 1945. The sun hangs low over a windswept Pacific POW camp, pale and cold. Rows of Japanese women stand in rigid lines, their eyes downcast, fingers clutching threadbare belongings, boots scuffing frozen dirt. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and fear. American officers and medics move among them, calm, methodical, carrying crates of supplies. From one crate, a small, unassuming package is passed forward, a makeup kit. The women pause, hesitation etched across their faces. Eyes dart sideways, unsure whether to recoil, ignore, or accept. A soft gasp escapes one as she lifts the compact, feeling the cool metal in her palm. The bitter wind presses against the camp, but inside this brief exchange, an unfamiliar warmth flickers. It is a small act, yet its impact is immediate. A line of fear, discipline, and suspicion stretches across their shoulders, then falters. Faces flicker between confusion and curiosity. In a world defined by surrender and defeat, the gesture feels impossibly intimate, almost absurd. For a moment, war shrinks to the size of a tin compact, and the women confront a reality they had not anticipated. By late 1944, the Pacific War had reached a critical turning point. Japanese forces, once confident and expansive across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, were now in retreat. The relentless advance of American and Allied troops had forced island garrisons to surrender or face annihilation. On mainland Japan and in occupied territories, the civilian population faced shortages of food, medicine, and basic goods, while the military infrastructure that had once seemed invincible was collapsing under the weight of sustained bombing campaigns and logistical failure. Women had played a central, if often overlooked, role in the war effort. From administrative duties to auxiliary military service, Japanese women were integrated into the nation's total war apparatus. Many were tasked with clerical work, field support, or factory labor, sustaining units stretched thin across vast, contested territories. Yet when defeat became inevitable, these women, like their male counterparts, faced the consequences of capture, exposure to enemy forces, dislocation from home, and the psychological burden of witnessing their nation's unraveling. The United States, now the dominant power in the Pacific, had begun systematic procedures for handling prisoners of war. American military doctrine emphasized a combination of security, organization, and, where feasible, humane treatment. Officers in charge of POW camps understood that maintaining order required more than confinement. It demanded predictable routines, sufficient nutrition, medical attention, and careful psychological management. The Geneva Conventions guided these operations, but local implementation often extended beyond the text, reflecting both practical necessity and a deliberate demonstration of moral authority. In these camps, women found themselves in unfamiliar circumstances, barely nourished, exhausted from long marches, and accustomed to the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Army and auxiliary units. They were thrust into an environment of rules enforced not through fear alone, but through structure and routine. Roll calls were precise, meals distributed according to set schedules, and daily inspections checked for illness or malnutrition. Even small gestures, such as the regular provision of hot food or a mug of coffee, became symbolic acts of authority, signaling not just care, but a contrast to the scarcity and unpredictability they had known under Japanese command. The cultural chasm between captor and captive was vast. Japanese women had been raised in a society emphasizing discipline, conformity, and the suppression of personal desires for the sake of collective duty. They had internalized propaganda portraying Americans as both technologically superior and morally decadent, yet ruthless. The arrival of practical, considerate treatment, the careful organization of meals, medical checks, and distribution of personal items disrupted those assumptions. Each act of decency was a subtle confrontation with preconceived notions about the enemy, prompting both confusion and reflection. Supply chains, often invisible in war narratives, were a critical factor. The American military's ability to deliver consistently high-quality rations, medical supplies, and personal items, even to remote or recently captured camps, demonstrated logistical mastery. Every tin of coffee, every loaf of bread, every neatly folded uniform or clean blanket was the tangible proof of a functioning system. For women who had endured years of scarcity, rationing, and the improvisation necessitated by wartime collapse, these small signs of efficiency carried enormous psychological weight. Beyond physical sustenance, the Americans understood the importance of sensory and psychological cues. Items considered trivial in peacetime, a bar of soap, a brush, or a compact of makeup, were employed thoughtfully. In particular, personal grooming items challenged prisoners' sense of hierarchy and expectation. These gestures communicated civility and humanity, contrasting sharply with the dehumanization often experienced in wartime. They served both practical and symbolic purposes, illustrating not just the presence of order, but the capacity for restraint and ethical conduct. As January 1945 progressed, the combination of routine, sustenance, and small acts of consideration began to reshape the daily experience of female prisoners. Observers noted gradual changes. Women stood a little straighter during roll calls, engaged with each other more openly, and approached medical inspections with less overt fear. The interplay of authority, care, and routine created an environment where trust, however tentative, could take root. These conditions set the stage for moments of unexpected vulnerability, such as receiving a makeup kit from an American officer, which, while simple, resonated with a deeper understanding of survival, hierarchy, and human dignity. This evolving dynamic of control, care, and cultural confrontation would define the prisoners' experience throughout the winter months, preparing them for encounters that challenged not only their expectations, but their internalized notions of loyalty, identity, and morality. Within the confines of the camps, daily life followed a strict rhythm, and for the Japanese women, every detail was both familiar and alien. Roll calls punctuated the day at dawn, midday, and dusk. Uniform inspections reminded them of the discipline once enforced within the Imperial Japanese Army. Yet here the scrutiny was procedural, not punitive. Guards and camp officers moved with quiet precision, observing but not harassing, enforcing rules without intimidation. Each orderly action reinforced the presence of control while simultaneously signaling restraint, a subtle exercise of authority that contrasted sharply with the chaos the women had witnessed during retreats across the Pacific. Meals were central to the rhythm of camp life. American rations, meticulously prepared and distributed, offered more than calories. They were a demonstration of systematic care. Bread, canned meats, powdered eggs, and hot coffee became daily constants, each serving a role in restoring both the body and the mind. The coffee, bitter and strong, was particularly symbolic. For women who had subsisted on substitutes, such as roasted barley or chicory for years, the genuine beverage was a tangible connection to stability and abundance. In diaries and post-war interviews, many recalled the first tentative sips, cautious at first, then gradually accepting, the warmth seeping into frozen hands, a sensory anchor amid displacement. Medical inspections reinforced both survival and psychological reassurance. Corpsmen checked for frostbite, malnutrition, and lingering injuries sustained during forced marches or from collapsing supply lines. Those suffering from exhaustion or illness received treatment in a manner emphasizing preservation rather than punishment. In the Stark barracks, the difference between American and Japanese approaches was stark. Whereas the imperial system often demanded endurance beyond reason, here attention to health was methodical and consistent. The women began to register that order, predictability, and care could coexist with captivity, a realization that subtly undermined long-held perceptions of power and submission. Documentation and labor assignments further shaped the prisoners' days. Some women were tasked with recording movements, cataloging supplies, or assisting with administrative tasks under American supervision. These activities, while monotonous, provided a measure of agency and engagement. The contrast between the disorganized, collapsing Japanese command structure and the organized efficiency of American operations became increasingly apparent. Through their work, the women could observe logistics, supply chains, and record-keeping at close range, small but undeniable proof of systemic strength. Cultural friction was omnipresent. The very act of receiving items associated with personal grooming, soap, brushes, and occasionally cosmetics provoked surprise and uncertainty. For women trained in strict codes of appearance, hygiene, and modesty, the introduction of American care items was disorienting. Such gifts carried layers of meaning. They were practical, yes, but also symbolic, conveying civility and a recognition of individuality within captivity. When combined with the daily routine of meals, inspections, and structured labor, these gestures contributed to a recalibration of expectations. The women began to differentiate between the enemy as a monolithic threat and the reality of human behavior, capable of both authority and compassion. Letters and limited communication with the outside world reinforced this perception. American policy allowed controlled correspondence, ensuring prisoners could maintain contact with family while adhering to security protocols. The practice of regulated correspondence, paired with consistent sustenance and hygiene, established a predictable environment that slowly alleviated anxiety. Over time, fear and suspicion gave way to tentative curiosity and grudging acknowledgement of the enemy's competence. Diaries from the period describe how the simplest acts, receiving a cup of coffee at the correct hour or being handed a makeup kit, were internalized as markers of a functioning, rational order that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the collapsing Reich. These routines were not merely logistical. They were psychological instruments. They allowed American officers to maintain discipline without overt coercion, preserving security while minimizing unrest. Observers noted subtle behavioral changes. Prisoners were calmer during roll calls, more cooperative during inspections, and displayed resilience in the face of harsh winter conditions. The combination of structure, sustenance, and minor acts of personal recognition facilitated an environment in which trust, even if cautious, could develop. By the spring of 1945, the significance of these structured routines became fully apparent. The women's adaptation to camp life, their ability to engage with work assignments, and their responsiveness to simple acts of consideration reflected both survival instinct and a nuanced impact of American operational and ethical frameworks. The cumulative effect of these small interventions, routine, nourishment, and gestures of respect, would prepare them for moments of acute psychological dissonance, such as receiving makeup kits, which bridged the worlds of war, captivity, and civilian identity. These foundations set the stage for exploring multiple perspectives on the experience, the human, tactical, and cultural angles that illuminate how small acts of organization and care could have profound effects on prisoners' perception of power, morality, and survival. The Japanese women POWs experienced a profound, if subtle, shift in perception during captivity. Initially tense and wary, every interaction, each meal, roll call, and inspection became a test of expectation versus reality. Diaries describe the cognitive dissonance. Routines were enforced, yet not harshly. Authority was present, yet tempered with restraint. A cup of coffee, bitter and hot, was more than a beverage. It was a ritual that signaled stability. The women's responses ranged from suspicion to tentative curiosity, then acceptance, illustrating how structured care could recalibrate deeply ingrained survival instincts. In these small gestures, the captives discovered agency within the confines of captivity, and a fragile trust began to take root, bridging the human gap between former enemies. The efficiency of the American camp system was not accidental. It was a tactical decision designed to maintain order with minimal force. Structured routines, roll calls at dawn, midday, and dusk, systematic medical inspections, and scheduled meals functioned as both logistical operations and psychological control mechanisms. By providing consistent care and predictable schedules, the American command minimized unrest and maximized compliance. The POWs' daily labor, including administrative work and record-keeping, doubled as a mechanism of surveillance, ensuring accountability while engaging prisoners in tasks that reinforced discipline. This tactical framework allowed the camp to operate smoothly despite the influx of thousands of surrendered personnel, demonstrating the strategic utility of humane, structured management in wartime logistics. Receiving personal items like soap, brushes, and makeup kits created a cultural dissonance for the Japanese women. Trained under strict norms of appearance, hygiene, and modesty, they initially regarded these gestures with disbelief or discomfort. The act of being offered cosmetics was at once practical and symbolic, a subtle acknowledgement of individuality and dignity. In a society accustomed to rigid hierarchy and group conformity, these small, foreign gestures of respect prompted reflection. They highlighted contrast between wartime scarcity and the Americans' ability to preserve civilian rituals. Through these acts, the POWs confronted the coexistence of authority and humanity, reshaping their understanding of identity, morality, and the complexities of the enemy beyond ideology. The officers in charge of the POW camp demonstrated leadership through measured balance of authority and humane treatment. They issued orders clearly, monitored compliance, and enforced discipline without resorting to brutality. Leaders recognized that calm efficiency and predictability reduced resistance and maintained operational stability. Their presence was authoritative but restrained, signaling that obedience did not require fear. By modeling respect and consistency, commanders influenced subordinate guards to act in alignment with policy, creating an environment where prisoners could trust in routines and daily provisions. The leadership approach underscored a philosophy of controlled power, authority exercised not only through threat, but through reliability, clarity, and the subtle reinforcement of morale for both staff and captives. The Japanese women observed, measured, and silently evaluated the Americans' approach. Many came from military cultures steeped in rigid hierarchy, harsh discipline, and ideological indoctrination. The stark contrast between expectation and experience was jarring. Small acts, like receiving a cup of coffee or a makeup kit, became a lens to comprehend the scale and sophistication of the American military machine. POW diaries later noted a grudging admiration for logistical precision, operational consistency, and humane oversight. For the women, these moments were both confusing and illuminating, challenging preconceived notions of enemy behavior, and highlighting that the collapse of Japan's military power was not merely a result of battlefield defeat, but also of superior organization, discipline, and moral calculation. The ethical implications of treating captives humanely were tangible and psychologically profound. Offering basic comforts, nutrition, and personal items served as both a moral statement and a strategic tool. Prisoners were reminded that authority could coexist with decency, that power need not necessitate cruelty. The psychological impact was profound. Fear gave way to tentative respect, suspicion softened into recognition of competence, and ideological rigidity cracked under the weight of lived reality. These gestures transcended immediate survival. They reshaped memory, morality, and the perception of wartime responsibility. In essence, the Americans' approach demonstrated that ethical conduct in conflict could leave as lasting an imprint as any combat operation, influencing how history would later judge both victors and vanquished. January 1945 had arrived with a bitter edge across Europe. Snow blanketed the shattered landscapes of the Western Front, turning mud and rubble into a frozen labyrinth. In the northern sector of France, American forces had begun consolidating captured territories, while the Wehrmacht, fractured and desperate, attempted to regroup. Within this chaos, the experiences of Japanese female prisoners of war in U.S.-administered camps took on extraordinary significance. Their world, once rigidly structured around obedience and ideology, now collided with a system both alien and incomprehensibly organized. The turning point began quietly, in the early hours of a cold morning. Prisoners were roused for the first roll call, a routine established weeks earlier. Yet today, it carried a deeper resonance. A shipment of makeup kits arrived from the Red Cross and American supply lines. The women, instructed to assemble in the communal hall, were unsure whether this was a gesture, a test, or a manipulation. Some glanced at one another, eyes wide, hands gripping coats and blankets as they followed the orderly lines toward the distribution tables. American camp personnel maintained their calm authority, moving with precision and patience. The kits, neatly arranged, contained items that were ordinary in peacetime Japan, yet luxuries in captivity. Powder, lip color, rouge, brushes. For these women, the objects were a shock, a disruption to every expectation of imprisonment. Their reactions were instinctively cautious. Fingers hovered over the items, hesitation etched in every movement. Some laughed nervously, others stiffened, a reflection of ingrained discipline meeting unexpected kindness. A particularly revealing moment occurred when Lieutenant Margaret H., the camp's senior female officer, approached a group of the prisoners. She demonstrated the proper application of each product, her gestures deliberate and unhurried. Cameras, operated by military documentarians, captured the scene. Hesitant smiles, furrowed brows, tentative curiosity. Diaries and post-war interviews recount how the women, previously unyielding under stress, allowed themselves small acts of self-expression for the first time in months. Powder-dusted cheeks, lips tinted, eyes brightened, yet not for vanity alone. These gestures were a reclamation of agency, subtle defiance against the dehumanization that captivity imposed. Beyond the personal transformation, the scene revealed operational mastery. The process was orderly. Every prisoner received equal access, every kid accounted for. Guards, trained to anticipate disorder, observed silently, ensuring neither favoritism nor chaos disrupted the distribution. The efficiency mirrored the broader American strategy. Control achieved not through fear, but through structure, reliability, and predictability. The juxtaposition of human kindness with military precision left a lasting impression on the prisoners, illustrating that victory could be manifested in logistics and psychological discipline as effectively as on the battlefield. Amid this, reports filtered in from the collapsing Japanese fronts. Airfields abandoned, rail lines severed, supply convoys destroyed. The macrocosm of defeat mirrored in microcosm within the camp. For the prisoners, the makeup kits became a lens through which to comprehend the broader machinery of war. If their captors could maintain order, supply lines, and humane oversight, then the collapse of their homeland's military apparatus was not inevitable, but a failure of organization and principle. This cognitive shift marked the emotional and intellectual turning point. The war's outcome was not abstract. It was visible in these small, precise, deliberate actions. Simultaneously, the psychological resonance was profound. Diaries describe an emergent calm, a lowering of tension across barracks. Conversations, once cautious and terse, carried hints of humor and tentative exchange. The women began to navigate their environment with awareness rather than anxiety. Each brush stroke, each carefully placed dab of powder, became a ritual of normalization, embedding the understanding that authority need not equate to cruelty. The camp, though still a place of detention, transformed into a proving ground for resilience, adaptation, and the nuanced understanding of human behavior amid war. As mid-morning arrived, the distribution concluded, and the women returned to their quarters, their faces subtly transformed. Yet the moment's significance extended beyond cosmetics. It underscored the fundamental principle shaping the final months of conflict, that the Americans' operational effectiveness, logistical mastery, and ethical conduct were inseparable components of victory. Here, in a modest POW hall, the intersection of human psychology, military discipline, and moral authority crystallized, offering insight into how wars are won not only through combat, but through administration, perception, and respect for the human dimension of conflict. By noon, new orders required the prisoners to assist with cataloging supplies, documenting camp routines, and managing records. These tasks, mundane yet critical, reflected a broader strategic vision. Engagement in structured activity fostered compliance, reinforced routine, and subtly imparted lessons about organizational integrity. Observers noted a marked reduction in tension, a willingness to cooperate, and even moments of quiet pride in accomplishing tasks with precision. The turning point, initially catalyzed by the arrival of makeup kits, had rippled through behavior, attitude, and understanding, a testament to the interplay of authority, kindness, and structure in shaping outcomes beyond the battlefield. The afternoon drew on, and the first hints of spring sun reflected off icy barracks windows. Outside, artillery fire echoed faintly from distant engagements, a reminder that conflict persisted. Yet inside, the prisoners' measured responses, the orderly distribution of supplies, and the quiet assertion of agency signified that the psychological and operational turning point had been reached. These small, deliberate acts of care, combined with rigorous logistical discipline, demonstrated a principle that historians would later underscore. Victory in war encompasses not only military triumph, but the mastery of human systems, perception, and morale. The story of Japanese women receiving makeup kits is thus not merely anecdotal. It is emblematic of a broader truth. In the final months of World War II, it was the meticulous interplay of compassion, order, and efficiency that revealed the collapse of the Axis powers, reshaped human understanding, and marked the beginning of a post-war reckoning. Each subtle gesture, observed and internalized by the prisoners, became a turning point, a bridge between fear and comprehension, between captivity and the dawning realization that the war was drawing to a close, and with it a new world order would emerge. As February 1945 progressed, the atmosphere in the camps settled into a delicate equilibrium. Winter's grip had not loosened, and icy winds swept across open courtyards, carrying with them the distant rumble of artillery and the sharp metallic scent of war. Yet within the barracks, the Japanese women prisoners moved with a newfound rhythm. The initial shock of receiving makeup kits had evolved into subtle daily routines: brushing hair, applying powder, adjusting uniforms, small gestures that asserted identity and autonomy within confinement. Each act reinforced the understanding that survival was not solely physical, but psychological, and that even minor tokens of normalcy could catalyze profound internal shifts. This period also revealed the interplay between individual experience and broader operational efficiency. Camp records show that as prisoners became accustomed to structured routines, incidents of insubordination or anxiety decreased markedly. Tasks such as inventory management, cleaning, and food preparation were completed with increased diligence. Officers noted that the women's improved morale translated directly into smoother administrative operations, illustrating a key principle. When authority is exercised with consistency and humane oversight, it enhances compliance, productivity, and mutual respect. The simple act of receiving makeup had catalyzed a chain reaction, affecting behavior, perception, and even the pace of daily operations. By mid-February, reports from the front underscored the collapse of Japanese military cohesion. Units stranded in the Philippines, Burma, and the home islands faced encirclement, starvation, and disorganized retreats. Communications had fractured, supply lines were obliterated, and strategic options had narrowed to desperation. For the prisoners, these reports, read aloud in the communal halls or documented in camp logs, confirmed what they had begun to sense. The world outside the camp had unraveled, and the Americans' methodical, disciplined approach contrasted starkly with the chaos of their homeland's military apparatus. In this context, the makeup kits became emblematic, a tangible representation of the structure and capability of the occupying forces. An illustrative episode occurred during a midday assembly when a small group of women was tasked with cataloging incoming Red Cross packages. One prisoner, previously withdrawn and silent, handled the inventory with meticulous care, carefully noting quantities and conditions. Observers recorded her expression, lips slightly parted in concentration, eyes alert, shoulders squared yet relaxed. This focus, rare in prior months, demonstrated the combined effect of structured routines and the subtle empowerment introduced by acts of trust and courtesy, such as the distribution of cosmetics. It was a turning point not in combat, but in human adaptation. The women were learning to navigate a system that valued accuracy, consistency, and civility over coercion. Meanwhile, American personnel documented the impact. Officers maintained logs detailing prisoner behavior, noting instances of cooperation, attention to hygiene, and participation in educational or vocational tasks. These reports would later inform post-war studies on the efficacy of humane treatment in POW management. The underlying lesson was clear. Control achieved through predictable care and structured engagement generated stability, minimized resistance, and fostered comprehension of authority, principles equally applicable on the battlefield as in a camp setting. By early March, external military developments reinforced the significance of these internal transformations. Allied advances along the Rhine and in northern Italy demonstrated the logistical superiority and strategic discipline of U.S. forces. The prisoners, tracking these reports through camp briefings, recognized that the efficiency that enabled them to receive regular meals, medical attention, and modest personal items mirrored the operational excellence driving the Allies forward. The contrast with the fragmented Japanese command structure highlighted the broader implications of organization, planning, and human consideration in the outcome of modern warfare. The psychological impact deepened when more personal gestures followed the initial distribution. Letters from home, rare but permitted, arrived with strict censorship. Red Cross parcels contained practical items and occasionally small luxuries. Each element reinforced the turning point. Captivity need not be dehumanizing if managed with foresight and empathy. Diaries written decades later describe how the combination of routine, small kindnesses, and opportunities for personal expression, such as grooming, writing, or assisting in administration, allowed the women to recalibrate their understanding of both authority and self. By mid-March, a subtle transformation was evident across the camp. The initial shock of receiving makeup had evolved into sustained adaptation. The women demonstrated measured engagement in their environment, completing tasks with accuracy, interacting with camp personnel with cautious civility and demonstrating resilience in the face of harsh winter conditions. For historians, this period illustrates a critical turning point in the human dimension of World War II. The ability of structured, humane administration to shape behavior, reinforce order, and bridge cultural divides in the final months of conflict. Even as distant artillery and the occasional air raid reminded the prisoners that the war persisted, their daily routines reflected a new reality. Survival was no longer contingent solely on endurance or compliance, but on the capacity to navigate a complex, organized system that balanced authority with care. The makeup kits, initially a symbol of bewilderment, had become markers of adaptation, signaling a broader shift in perception. They embodied the subtle, human victories achieved behind the front lines, a quiet testament to how civility, organization, and attention to individual dignity could influence morale, compliance, and comprehension, shaping the final stages of the conflict as much as any battle. As spring approached, the camp stood as a microcosm of the larger war, a world where structure, foresight, and humane treatment intersected with the collapse of enemy systems. The turning point, forged through minor but meaningful interventions, demonstrated that victory in modern warfare encompassed not only firepower, but psychological insight, operational discipline, and the recognition of human needs even amidst profound upheaval. Within these walls, Japanese women POWs experienced a pivotal shift, a realization that the principles sustaining the American military machine were not only tactical but moral, logistical, and profoundly transformative. By April 1945, the full scope of Japan's military collapse had become unmistakable. Across the Pacific and East Asia, Japanese forces were in disarray. Isolated garrisons in the Philippines had surrendered or been neutralized. Naval assets were largely incapacitated, and supply lines were severed by relentless Allied naval and air operations. Intelligence reports indicate that morale among frontline units had plummeted. Desertions increased, and units often disbanded before engagement. Within the POW camps, Japanese women were acutely aware of these developments. Conversations and diaries reveal a mixture of disbelief, anxiety, and reluctant acknowledgement that the forces they once revered were no longer capable of sustaining the war effort. Each news bulletin, whether delivered verbally or via censored reports, reinforced the prisoners' understanding of the broader strategic defeat. The impact on the camp's daily life was immediate and measurable. With surrender widespread, camp administration shifted from crisis management to stabilization. American officers maintained routines that balanced discipline with humane treatment, structured meal schedules, daily roll calls, hygiene inspections, and vocational or educational tasks. Reports from the Quartermaster Corps confirm that food rations remain consistent, with coffee, bread, and canned goods delivered reliably. This predictable structure continued to influence prisoner behavior. Cooperation increased, incidents of disorder decreased, and the women began to assume responsibility for maintaining personal spaces and communal areas. In essence, the collapse of their homeland's command structures highlighted the contrast between disorder and the systematic provision of care, reinforcing trust in the occupying forces. One of the most profound indicators of transformation was the psychological adaptation of the prisoners. Diaries and post-war interviews indicate that initial feelings of fear, shame, and confusion gradually gave way to cautious acceptance and even modest expressions of personal agency. Small acts, previously unimaginable under Japanese military orthodoxy, became normalized. Exchanging polite words with guards, assisting in inventory management, or engaging in modest self-care rituals. The makeup kits, introduced months earlier, symbolized more than cosmetic change. They marked the first instance in captivity where the women experienced a measure of choice and control over their own presentation, reinforcing the psychological benefits of structured yet considered oversight. At the same time, broader military realities reinforced the significance of these transformations. Allied forces advanced steadily, capturing key strategic locations and crippling Japanese operational capacity. Intelligence summaries document that, by late April, communication with several home islands had been disrupted entirely, leaving remaining Japanese commands isolated. For the POWs, this information underscored a critical truth. The world beyond the camp had shifted irrevocably, and survival now depended on adaptation rather than resistance. Those who embraced routines, engaged constructively with camp administration, and maintained composure under oversight were better positioned to navigate the uncertainties of captivity and the approaching end of hostilities. Medical records from the period reveal tangible physical consequences of these shifts. Consistent nutrition, regular hygiene inspections, and access to basic medical care mitigated the severe effects of prolonged malnutrition and exposure. Many women regained weight, frostbite, and minor infections were treated promptly, and overall health stabilized. Observers noted that improved physical well-being correlated with increased participation in administrative tasks and cooperative behavior, illustrating a direct link between care, morale, and functional compliance. The interplay between human needs, structured routines, and moral oversight thus extended beyond psychological resilience into measurable improvements in health and capacity. Cultural contrasts also became increasingly evident. The prisoners' previous experiences under rigid Japanese military discipline had emphasized obedience through fear, scarcity, and ideological indoctrination. In contrast, the American system demonstrated that authority could coexist with consideration, that order could be maintained without cruelty, and that small acts of respect, consistent meals, personal items, hygiene support, could profoundly influence perception and cooperation. These realizations, subtle yet persistent, prepared the women for the final stages of the war and the post-war transition, providing them with frameworks for understanding authority, trust, and human dignity in unprecedented circumstances. This combination of operational efficiency, structured care, and cultural insight shaped the final weeks before surrender. While artillery and air strikes continued to echo across distant theaters, the camp itself had become a microcosm of what effective governance and humane oversight could achieve. The prisoners' growing adaptation, reflected in both behavior and mindset, foreshadowed the outcomes of the war's conclusion. Systematic Allied victory, organized occupation, and the enduring influence of measured, principled administration on populations previously subjected to rigid and punitive military control. By late April, the stage was set for the ultimate transition: formal surrender, the cessation of hostilities, and the beginning of reintegration into a world reshaped by both military defeat and structured compassion. Within the camp, the final weeks crystallized the lessons learned over months of captivity, establishing enduring patterns of resilience, cooperation, and subtle empowerment. The actions of the Americans, distributing meals, providing coffee, offering personal items, and maintaining routine, had transformed the environment from one of fear to one of tentative stability, illustrating how micro-level interventions could echo across the human experience of war. The formal surrender of Japanese forces in May 1945 marked the culmination of months of incremental collapse, both on the battlefield and within POW camps. In occupied areas, American officers oversaw the orderly processing of captives, including Japanese women who had endured months of dislocation, deprivation, and uncertainty. Camp records indicate that processing included detailed inventories, medical examinations, and personal debriefings. Each document served dual purposes: verifying compliance and gathering intelligence, while simultaneously reinforcing routine and structure that had become central to the prisoners' adaptation. The act of recording, of sitting quietly as officers noted names, duties, and observations became an extension of the psychological transition that had begun months earlier with small gestures of care, including the provision of regular meals, coffee, and personal hygiene items. Numerical documentation highlights the scale of the operation. By May, the camp housed several hundred female POWs, ranging from auxiliary personnel to administrative clerks, many of whom had experienced direct combat or retreat under extreme conditions. Medical summaries show that over 60% of these women exhibited signs of malnutrition or exhaustion upon initial arrival. Yet by the end of April, consistent rations and basic health care had stabilized physical conditions across the population. Intelligence officers noted that compliance rates were high. Roll calls were conducted without incident, sanitation standards were maintained, and administrative tasks, such as inventory management and record-keeping, were performed reliably. These outcomes underscore the effectiveness of structured sustenance and humane oversight as tools for maintaining order and reducing unrest. Personal accounts and post-war memoirs provide rich insight into the prisoners' emotional landscape during surrender. Many women recalled the surreal experience of receiving makeup kits, warm clothing, or cups of coffee from the Americans, items that simultaneously symbolized personal dignity and the tangible contrast between the disciplined Allied occupation and the disintegrated Japanese command structure. Diaries detail the nuanced psychological impact. Fear and ingrained obedience coexisted with curiosity, relief, and emerging trust. The simple act of being offered coffee, repeatedly and predictably, became emblematic of a broader moral and logistical superiority, reinforcing the stark difference between the chaos of retreating Japanese units and the organized competence of the American administration. Beyond individual camps, reports from the Quartermaster Corps and the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Service contextualize these experiences within the wider operational landscape. Strategic assessments noted that the systematic treatment of POWs, adherence to the Geneva Conventions, and consistent provision of food and shelter contributed to broader objectives. Maintaining discipline, securing intelligence, and demonstrating the ethical conduct of occupying forces. These measures were contrasted explicitly against accounts of mistreatment within the collapsing Japanese military system, creating both a psychological and practical demonstration of operational advantage. The surrender process also had long-term administrative and legal implications. Formal documentation of prisoners' identities, duties, and health status became central to post-war tribunals, repatriation planning, and broader historiography. Officers meticulously recorded behavior, compliance, and adaptation, producing a body of evidence that would inform not only immediate military decisions, but also post-war narratives concerning conduct, resilience, and the moral dimensions of captivity. The meticulous attention to detail reinforced the principle that systematic, humane management of prisoners could mitigate unrest and produce reliable outcomes, even under the pressures of mass surrender. In parallel, the physical and cultural environment of the camp mirrored the prisoners' evolving state. Barracks were maintained with order. Communal kitchens served rations consistently. Sanitary practices were observed, and educational or vocational tasks were offered where feasible. The contrast with prior wartime scarcity and unpredictability was stark, reinforcing the practical lessons of survival, adaptation, and obedience under a foreign authority that combined efficiency with humanity. Such patterns of care, repeated daily, produced subtle but durable psychological transformations, creating a baseline of resilience that would carry beyond the camp walls. By the conclusion of hostilities, the Japanese women in these camps had internalized the reality of defeat and the implications of Allied occupation. Surrender was not merely a military act. It was a social and moral transition, mediated through structured routines, reliable sustenance, and gestures of human decency. Coffee, meals, hygiene, and personal items became recurring symbols of stability, reinforcing trust in an unfamiliar authority while simultaneously highlighting the stark collapse of their former military hierarchy. The war's end was thus experienced not only through headlines or distant battles, but also through the intimate, daily interactions that structured life within the camps. As formal repatriation plans began, the camps transitioned from spaces of survival to sites of preparation for return to civilian life or reassignment. The systematic documentation, humane oversight, and routines established in the preceding months ensured that prisoners could leave under conditions that preserved dignity, health, and a sense of personal agency. The final testament to the efficacy of structured, principled management in the closing chapters of the Pacific War. The story of Japanese women POWs, confronted with both defeat and unexpected care, offers a profound window into the human dimensions of warfare. In the final months of conflict, amid the collapse of armies and the dismantling of logistical networks, it was often the smallest acts: a cup of coffee, a warm blanket, a sheet of paper to record one's name, that conveyed meaning far beyond their material value. These gestures became instruments of stability, markers of authority, and conduits of human dignity. In a world consumed by strategy, firepower, and ideology, such details illuminated the intersection of power and compassion. History frequently remembers battles, strategies, and leaders, yet the experiences of individuals, especially those often overlooked like female auxiliaries and prisoners, reveal the enduring consequences of both war and its cessation. The women's reactions to American provision, whether coffee, makeup kits, or steady rations, reflect the interplay of psychology, culture, and morality. They illustrate that surrender and captivity are not merely legal or military states, but deeply human experiences shaped by ritual, routine, and respect. Even amid loss, fear, and dislocation, small consistencies created a framework in which trust, resilience, and selfhood could survive. From a broader perspective, these moments demonstrate that the end of conflict is defined not solely by treaties or headlines, but by the quiet, cumulative effects of structured care, ethical administration, and logistical competence. The Allies' ability to maintain order while honoring human dignity contrasted sharply with the chaos of the collapsing Japanese system, emphasizing that efficiency and morality need not be mutually exclusive. These lessons resonate far beyond the specific context of 1945, offering enduring insight into how societies may navigate the delicate transition from war to peace. Ultimately, the image of a tin cup held in cold hands, the aroma of coffee in a barracks, the hesitant trust given to former enemies, captures the essence of human resilience. It is a reminder that even amidst devastation, the human capacity to recognize civility, adapt to circumstance, and retain dignity persists, and that these quiet acts of care can leave as lasting an imprint on memory and history as any battlefield or military triumph.